both. I've always been fascinated with history ever since as long as I can remember, frankly. And to me, I've always believed that history really matters. And it matters, you think about history, you think about statues, monuments to guys on horses, stuff like that. And I would point out, and I think this has become more apparent in recent years, it matters what we memorialize, but it also matters, and we have to pay attention to what we do not memorialize. And so I'm going to talk about just some personal experiences with history that sort of surprised me, things that I didn't realize and that I'm continuing to sort of learn from, both in my family's personal history and in just things that I read in the newspaper. So I have sort of 4 points. Should I just go on ahead with the PowerPoint?
Yes, please do.
Okay, bear with me. And I will note, I'm just, as I go along, I'm going to use some images that I've collected just sort of as illustrations of what I'm talking about. I think sometimes a picture can tell 1,000 words. A few of the pictures are very disturbing. I'll warn people right now, and I'll sort of flag that for you before I go in it. So anyhow, basically in 2016, I happened to be reading the paper and I hit a story about Emmett Till. Emmett Till is very renowned name of a young man who died a very unfortunate death in Mississippi in 1954. Basically his death helped trigger the civil rights movement and the drive to enshrine civil rights and restore full enfranchisement to African Americans in the United States after the Jim Crow years. So I thought, okay, this was all settled history, right? Well, apparently it's not, because there we go. There are a number of memorials in Mississippi relating to the story of Emmett Till. And basically, some people are still shooting at the monuments, as you can see here. This sign, placard, commemorates the spot on the Tallahatchie River where Emmett's dead body was dragged and recovered from the river. So what happened was, this is Emmett Till. He was a young man of 14. He lived in Chicago. Like many African Americans, his family migrated north because of, for lack of a better term, the oppression in Jim Crow South. His family sought opportunity in Chicago. There are a lot of jobs with the industrial expansion. So his family moved up north, but they had relatives down in Mississippi. So he was spending the summer with his relatives in a place called Money, Mississippi. And one day he was in this grocery store, Bryant's grocery store in Money, Mississippi. And what was alleged was he got fresh with Mrs. Bryant, who was the wife of the owner of the store. It's unclear whether he whistled at her or looked at her inappropriately, just not clear. But supposedly something happened when the two of them were alone. He had been there with friends. So 2 days later, 2 men came to his relative's house where he was staying, and they took him away. And what they did was they beat him, they mutilated him, and they ended up killing him and dropping his body in the river. And they recovered his body, and his mother, who was in Chicago, absolutely insisted that they bring the remains of her child back to Chicago. And she insisted that they hold an open casket funeral so people could see what had been done to her child. And I'm going to go to the next photo is the remains of Emmett Till. And that helped trigger the civil rights movement. Rosa Parks fighting for a seat on the bus. I think mainly because, first of all, a lot of African Americans said, this can't go on anymore. We can't allow ourselves to be treated like this. And also a number of white people said, this is bad. We can't allow our fellow Americans to be treated this way. And so then you have the whole cycle with civil rights movement. So I was quite struck by that. And I decided, I needed to do something, engage in a little historical activism, if you will. And shortly thereafter, maybe like a year after, I was on a domestic assignment in Washington for 2 years. We lived in Alexandria, Virginia, which is a nice old town, just sort of southeast of Washington proper, along the Potomac River. Well, I didn't realize it, but in that nice town, there were 2 lynchings of Black men. This was going back to the Jim Crow era, which roughly speaking is about 1870 until the 1960s. The civil rights movement finally pushed back on it. So I joined this group that were working with the city to commemorate the lynching. What they were trying to do was to put a memorial, a plaque, where he had been lynched and to remember that. And there's an organization in the United States called the Equal Justice Initiative. And they encourage racial dialogue, but the important part is for people to recognize what happened. I, as a white guy from the Midwest, none of my family really suffered from any kind of lynchings, not that I'm aware of, or other kind of racial unrest or disorders. But many Black Americans, they did lose relatives. Maybe they had to leave town like right away and leave all their possessions and leave the graves of their ancestors. And you have, in order to have a better, more realistic relationship with other Americans, Black Americans, you have to recognize that the other person has a little more baggage in their history, and their family grew up with a very different relation towards white people. And once we start to recognize that, we can hopefully move beyond. So in any case, I was with a group of about, I think we have up to 13 people. We were working on research. We were reading the newspapers at the time. And basically, this was the illustration the newspaper put up on the man being lynched. He was hung from a lamp pole post. They grabbed a rope off a local store. But the funny thing about this illustration is you don't see any of the people that lynched him, which was unusual. The newspaper accounts talked about maybe 400 people, but they never identified a single person. They said, some people had their hats pulled over their head. It was dark. They couldn't see him. That's basically a lie. It was townspeople from Alexandria that did this. Some of their relatives are still, the people that did it are dead and gone. But some of the people, their relatives are still in Alexandria, and they don't want to talk about it, understandably. But to give you an idea of what a lynching looks like, I'm going to show you a picture of one from the 1920s in America. And you can see it was like a big civic event where everyone was standing around looking at the people that had been lynched. And back in those days,
a very, very disturbing.
Yeah,
that's a very disturbing image. Wow.
I moved beyond that. Yeah.
No, you don't.
But I think it's important to know what it really looked like.
Yeah. Now, thanks for sharing.
So
We're seeing something like that where people are just standing around spectating it like they're at a circus. It's very disturbing to see.
it's like a picnic.
Mhm.
And moreover, they would take souvenirs. They were taking like pieces of the post where the individual was hung. They would, make postcards. They would take photographs. They saw nothing wrong with it. So one thing that I found very, very moving that the Equal Justice Initiative does is when they make one of these commemorations, and they've documented thousands of lynchings that took place, mainly in the American South, but not exclusively. And they go there to the site and they take a jar of soil from where the lynching took place with the person's name on it, the date, where it took place. And they store all of these and display them in a museum in Montgomery, Alabama. And once I saw that picture, I was really very moved, and it really brings it home, sort of the humanity of these crimes and the fact that an individual really died, and that's from where it took place. So in any case, that was my experience with the Equal Justice Initiative. If you're interested, they have a very good website with a lot of articles and papers on racial relations in the United States and the fraught history of race in America.
I'll put a link in the YouTube chat right now for the Equal Justice Initiative.
Yeah, it's just eji.org. So, and you let me know if I'm going on too long. It's a story I feel a lot of passion about. So,
I understand.
anyhow,
please continue.
Anyhow, so one of the other things a history buff does is I've been doing family genealogy, particularly as I'm not able to go around Algeria quite as much as I would like. And so I research, family history. There's some online sites where you can access census records are very helpful, birth certificates, death certificates, what have you. A lot of different information's out there. Some of it's imperfect, but I was researching my grandmother. And my grandmother was from Springfield, Illinois. I knew her until she passed away in 1982. She's always my grandma. But her family came from Springfield, Illinois. Springfield, Illinois is well known as the city. It's not only the capital of Illinois, but it's known as the home of Abraham Lincoln. And you can go see Abraham Lincoln's house from before he became president. He lived in Springfield. I've seen that house many times because we used to have relatives that were living still there. And I've been through that house 2-3 times. And it's this old house, it's nice that Abraham Lincoln lived there. But okay, so my grandmother was born in 1907. So I'm looking at records and I'm kind of curious, okay, what was Springfield known for? What was there, like a factory there? It's a fairly substantial town, but I wanted to know a little bit more about the background. And so I look at the Wikipedia article, and lo and behold, to my surprise, there was a major race riot in 1908 when my grandmother was 1 year old. She obviously was not a party to any of this, but this was going on around her. And growing up, I never heard about this. I never knew it existed. And so I read about it a little more. And what had happened in 1908, you had racial animosities being fueled by the press. And there were a couple of crimes that were allegedly committed by African Americans. The local citizenry, some of the local citizenry tried to lynch those African Americans. They did not succeed. And so unfortunately, they took out their aggression on the Black neighborhood, and they burned a lot of houses down, and a lot of people were lynched. Some white people were shot. Some of the black people were armed. And the governor actually had to bring in the militia. Where you see back here, those are Illinois State National Guard. And they eventually put the thing down. I'm happy to say that at least some of the people that did this were criminally charged. I don't know if they necessarily had to do jail time for this, but you can see the damage is quite substantial in that neighborhood. So I was taken aback, and Grandma never said anything about this. I never knew it existed, but I went back on Google Earth just to look at that particular neighborhood, which happened to be a 10-minute walk from where Grandma was a little baby. And right now it's just flat. It's just parking lot. I don't know if that happened much later or not, but, and there are a few plaques there commemorating it. That's been a recent phenomenon, and that's been certainly a step for the good to recognize that this happened. So that was one thing that was sort of surprising to me. And so
a question. Can I ask you a question?
You just did.
That my second question, after asking if I can ask you a question, is why do you think your grandmother never spoke about this? Why do you think you never heard about this before?
I think the family just didn't want to talk about it. I doubt that she had much of a recollection of it. She was 1 year old, but I assume like she was aware of it from family. But yeah, it's just something people didn't want to deal with. That's my assumption.
Because it's a shameful part of history, or
they don't want to deal on negativity, which is also a Midwest characteristic too. We tend to be very optimistic, us Midwesterners.
Exactly. Jeff is saying we're both from a region in the United States called the Midwest, where people are known to be very nice, and they also don't want to talk about difficult things. This is a stereotype of people from the Midwest, but it's often accurate.
Agreed.
Go on.
Okay. So anyhow, I continue my research, and the family eventually moved to Iowa. That part I knew about. That was not surprising. But I pull up a census record from 1920. Okay, so it's like 13 years after this episode. I pull up a census record. And the family, I can see my grandmother, her father, which is my great-grandfather, great-grandmother, and I think she had one sibling at the time. I think it was Bill. And they were living in a place called Bogalusa, Louisiana. And I had never heard of Bogalusa, Indiana. And I was very surprised. No one ever told me that she lived in, did I say Indiana? I meant Louisiana. No one had ever told me she lived in Louisiana. And I can't ask her now because she passed away quite some time ago. And so I do what I normally do. I look it up on the internet, on Wikipedia, and I found out Bogalusa was a major factory town. It sits along the Mississippi River. And in the early 20th century, they built the United States' largest sawmill in Bogalusa. It was actually owned and operated by the Goodyear family that the average American thinks of as the tire people, but they also had this big sawmill. And so I'm reading along, and lo and behold, I learned that the year before, there was racial and labor unrest in Bogalusa. Basically, long story short, the workers in that factory wanted to organize for better conditions, better wages, and what have you. And the owners, the management, did not want to allow that. And at the time, and again, this was something I never knew about until I started reading it really just like a month or two ago. The union organizers realized it was to their benefit to organize with African Americans, because what would happen if they didn't? If they went on strike, the owners would fire them and they would hire replacement workers, and they would get someone that would work cheap, and they would get African Americans because they might not have a lot of other opportunities. So they realized we're going to have a Black union that's a chapter with the white union. And they actually sort of unified their efforts to better their collective lives. So it appears there's a lot of history on this. I haven't read it all, but it appears what the owners tried to do was divide and conquer. They were coming down on the union through tried and true methods, but they tried to stir up as much racial animosity as they could. It was sort of this divide and conquer thing. And they actually lynched a number of the Black unionists. And there you can see some of the gentlemen in the illustration that worked for the owners, or their sort of business interests, as they said, euphemistically. So again, that's something I learned, and this seemed to be just sort of concealed history. And this is something grandmother probably knew about. I suspect her father was brought in as a strike breaker, or the less flattering way of referring to it is a scab. He was coming down there to work. For whatever reason, I may never know, the family didn't stick around there, and they ended up moving to a place called Bonaparte, Iowa, from which my grandmother eventually found a job, found my grandfather, and had a large family out in farm country in Iowa. So again, this is something I learned, and I hadn't expected it, and it's just sort of this concealed history. And I think the more you probe in history, you run into things like this. There's sort of, something that you just sort of bump into that you don't expect. So I thought that was interesting, and I thought it was appropriate to share on Black History Month. So that's my 2 cents. With that, I'm going to take the share down and entertain any and all questions.
Thanks, Jeff. That was very interesting. People can ask questions in the YouTube chat and we will get them to Jeff. We do have a few questions that have already come in. Before we get to those though, Jeff, I would like to ask you, you clearly have a great interest in history. You are interested in researching places where your family are from or where you grew up. What advice would you have to people with a similar interest, people in Algeria, who are interested in learning more about the town in which they're from? So how do you start researching a place in the history of that place?
Well, I mean, the one thing I do, because I'm here in Algeria for an extended period, and I know some things about Algeria, but there's a lot I don't know. And my favorite tool, and I'm not trying to promote any websites, but I go to Wikipedia and I look, okay, what's the history of this place? And I also like, I'm a visual guy. I'll go on to Google Maps and I'll just sort of like look around. It's like, oh, are there any famous monuments here? Are there mosques, museums, marketplaces? What does the city look like? Is it old or is it recent? Is it more planned in a European style? One thing I have found, one little tip I'll share, is Wikipedia comes in many different languages. And when I look up maybe a smaller city in Algeria, just out of curiosity, it's like, maybe I'll drive to this place. But a lot of times in English, there's not much information. But I find I can go to the French site for that town, and often there's a lot more information. That's what I like to do. And by that same token, when I travel around Europe, I might look at the German site or the Polish site when I'm traveling in Germany or Poland, and usually there's a lot more information available.
So that's a good tip for research. It helps to be multilingual because sometimes that research is not in the language you're looking for it in. So it's good to check that out. Okay, thank you for sharing that. So we have a couple questions that came in about racism. These are the two questions. Feti Benasai says, hi, Jeff. Were things more difficult for African Americans in the South? Was it better living up north? I'll get to the other questions next, but if you could address that.
That's hard to say. The North was not perfect, but I mean, the South definitely had built up a whole system known colloquially as Jim Crow. I don't even know where the term came from, but there was a way they had instituted a lot of checks to keep African Americans from voting, to keep them indebted, to keep them working in fields. If they sort of got out of their place, so to speak, frequently they would come down on them, and occasionally they would use lynching as a form of sort of racial terror to keep people down. But there was certainly racism in northern places. A lot of times they would not save the best jobs for Blacks. A lot of times the Blacks got the less appealing jobs, like cleaning up slaughterhouses or what have you. But I think the walls were less solid in the North. I will say that. That is my assumption. I think there's a lot of history there that I don't know. And like we saw in Springfield just a few minutes ago, there were race riots in the North, in Chicago. There was a particularly bad one in Tulsa, but throughout the North, that sort of thing would happen occasionally, infrequently, but it did happen. And so I would say generally it was better in the North. I mean, you could see that there were large migration flows of Blacks moving north, and I assumed they were doing that for objective reasons for their own benefit. So I'll leave it at that. I've probably talked too much.
No, thank you for that. We have a question from It's Yes Crafty, who asks, do you think that racism against Black people is still going, and why? Very similar question from Sophia Mez, who says, I have a really important question. Why is skin color still an issue in the United States for some people, even though it's 2021?
Well, let's see. Now, let me circle back to the first question. Is there still racism? Was that what it is?
Is there still racism against Black people in the United States?
I think inarguably there is. I mean, the thing that sort of set me off on this little journey was the fact that some people, I assume white people, were shooting up that sign. And they clearly hated Emmett Till, or they hated the civil rights movement, and that was sort of their way of striking back. And I was sort of shocked, because being an optimistic Midwesterner, I think, okay, we fixed this problem and we can move on now. And it's not fixed. And I think it was very apparent from what you saw last summer with the demonstrations in the United States after the death in police custody of George Floyd. You see a lot of African Americans dying in police custody, and you do not see nearly as many white people dying in police custody. And that says something that the police or members of the police force believe rough treatment is permissible. And you see sort of an ongoing history and an ongoing dialogue in the United States on how this should be addressed.
I would just add to that, I think that we are talking about racism in the United States. White people are talking about racism in the United States much more in these past couple years than ever before, outside of the civil rights movement, which took place in the 1960s. We're talking about it a lot more now because of more publicized cases of police brutality, or where police arrest or assault a Black person based on their appearance rather than a crime that they committed. And we're, you've heard of the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States. So it's just something that is talked about a lot more now in the United States.
It's higher profile.
It's higher profile, yes. And then if you wanted to address that second question, well, it's kind of the same question. Why is skin color still an issue in the US?
There's some people that it's an issue.
Yeah.
I mean, it's traditionally been something that differentiated Black people from white people. And it was just sort of a marker that people would see and people would be concerned about. I mean, it's sort of the one of the core issues with racism. They say, well, you're a different color. You're different for whatever reason, but that's been more often than not the historical focus in the United States.
Thanks. And there was a question that came in whether Black History Month is celebrated worldwide. And I just wanted to say that African American History Month, Black History Month, they're synonyms. You can say either. Started in the United States, but I did read that it actually is celebrated in Canada, Ireland, the Netherlands, in the UK. So we call it African American History Month because we're celebrating the achievements and accomplishments of Black Americans, but other countries also celebrate achievements of Blacks, of African people of African descent living in their country. So it's kind of a worldwide holiday now, but more specific to the US. Jeff, another question for you. I'm curious how you would respond. Some people might say, well, we should only focus on positive things, focus on positive accomplishments of Black Americans, for instance, and not focus on these negative things. I mean, we just saw a presentation where you showed us, picture of someone in a casket and picture of Black men who had been lynched. It's pretty dark and disturbing stuff. Why not just focus on positive things?
I think it's important to have the full context. I mean, I do agree it is important to focus on the positive things, the accomplishments of African Americans, and look away from these dark chapters. But if you don't grapple with them, if you're not conscious of them, you often you find yourself repeating the same things.
How can we avoid repeating the same things? How does learning about history prevent us from repeating the same mistakes?
Just sort of make us sensitive to give us a little more insight into what it's like walking in someone else's shoes, or consider their family history might be very different. They might have had some very unhappy things in their family history. Maybe they didn't. But I think you want a more comprehensive picture to better understand things.
So it makes us more empathetic to people by learning about what other people went through who are different than ourselves.
Teach you a little humility too is important.
I think that's right. Okay, Jeff, on a much lighter note, we can all see the games that are stacked up behind you. So I'm curious, what is your favorite game?
Oh, they're all good.
What game would you recommend to an Algerian to play that could maybe help them practice English or learn something about American culture?
Checkers.
Checkers. Not chess?
They could play chess. They could learn about America by playing chess.
Oh, is checkers a specifically American game?
I honestly don't know.
Okay.
It's been a long time since I played checkers.
Okay, another question. You've been in Algeria for a while now. I'm sure our audience would love to hear your impressions of their country, maybe a delicious Algerian dish that you've eaten, someplace beautiful you've traveled to, or just a cool experience that you've had living here in Algeria.
I like, I haven't been out as much as I'd like to, but I do really like the Jardin d'Essai. The botanical garden is quite impressive. I do like walking around the downtown, the center of Algiers, with all the old buildings and all the streets going hither and yon. And I like the fruits and vegetables are very good here.
Mhm. Agree with all of that. Well, Jeff, you are, in addition to being a diplomat and historian, you're quite the linguist. I listed all the languages you speak at the beginning of this talk. I wonder if you have any advice for Algerians who are trying to learn a new language, if you have any language learning tips that have helped you.
I think different people learn languages different ways. Practicing it, listening to living speakers. Now it's a lot easier than when I first started, in that you can just go to YouTube, like one in English from the U.S.Embassy, and actually listen to native speakers. The internet has just opened up a lot of doors on that stuff. I like to read newspapers. I'm sort of old school. I like to have a dictionary and try and force myself to read as much as I can, looking up as few words as I can. I try and sort of force myself to make sense out of it. I'm able to read French fairly well without a dictionary. German, I still struggle. But then other languages, it's sort of hit or miss.
Okay, good tips. Yeah, I guess it is different for everyone, but Jeff's tips are listen to native speakers, try to read, and then only look up the words when you need to in a dictionary. Good tips. And I think that we're gonna end it there. I don't see any more questions coming in for Jeff. Jeff, thank you so much for sharing your interest with us. Very interesting historical topic. Thank you everyone for watching on YouTube. Some people have asked whether the American Cultural Center Algiers is reopened, and unfortunately, no, we're not reopened yet. We will let you know when we are reopened, but our other 4 American spaces, there's one in Constantine, Oran, Bashar, and Morgala, those are open. So if you live near those, I really encourage you to go check those out safely, wear a mask, sanitize your hands, and we'll let you know when the American Cultural Center Algiers reopens. But in the meantime, we're doing talks like this one online instead. And you don't want to miss these talks. You especially don't want to miss next week's talk. It's going to be all about music. We have a Brooklyn-based musical artist who's going to perform for you. It's going to be a really fun talk. That's next Wednesday, March 3rd at 6 p.m. So be sure to follow us on Instagram. So follow the U.S.Embassy Algiers on Instagram, on Facebook, and hit the red subscribe button on YouTube so you don't miss any more talks. Jeff, again, thank you. Thank you everyone for watching. I'm Emily, and I'll see you next week.
Okay, thanks for putting up with me.